அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். இன்று பாராளுமன்ற தேர்தல் அறிவிக்கப்பட்டிருக்கும் காலப்பகுதியில் பிரித்தானியாவில் தொழிற்கட்சியின் முக்கிய உறுப்பினர்களில் ஒருவரான ஜான் மேக்டொனால்ட் அவர்களை நாங்கள் இங்கே சந்திக்க வந்திருக்கின்றோம். அவரிடமிருந்து பல தகவல்களை அறிந்து கொள்ளலாம் என்றிருக்கின்றோம். நாம் இந்த உரையாடலை இனி ஆங்கிலத்திலே தொடர இருக்கின்றோம். So on behalf of the Tamil community in Britain, British Tamils, we would like to ask some questions and to put forward especially your policies and party policies towards the general election.
Sure.
So I'll just straight into dive into the questions. One of the key issues, especially for the Tamil community in the UK, is about the foreign policy of British foreign policy, and especially what happened to them and why they had to come to this country. And we are very grateful that Britain has actually, hosted most of us and doing very well here. But on the other hand, the accountability issues still linger around. But one of the key questions posed by Tamils is that in 2009, when the whole massacre and genocide happened in Sri Lanka, Labour was in power. Gordon Brown was the Prime Minister then. So what would be different now? What would be kind of your promise, and what would be have changed in terms of the narratives in Labour?
You've got to remember, in 2009, and even before then, Jeremy Corbyn, who's now the leader of the Labour Party, and me, we were both on those protests in Parliament Square. We joined with the Tamil community in this country to try to expose what was happening, what others have described as a genocide that was taking place there. We've seen it, 40,000 deaths. So now in the Labour Party we have a leader who stood with the Tamil community in the most difficult circumstances and has spoken out on their behalf, condemned the Sri Lankan government and what happened, condemned the barbarity in terms of both the killings, the disappearances, the removal of people from their land, the loss of their homes. You've got a Labour leader now who's fundamentally someone who's devoted his life to human rights and campaigning for human rights, and has taken up the cause consistently on behalf of the Tamils. Now the difference will be we will now have a Labour government elected where human rights will be at the core of our foreign policy, and that means saying to any government, Sri Lankan or whoever else, if they're abusing human rights, we will make sure we will isolate them, condemn them, expose what's going on. We will not be selling them arms in the same way we've campaigned against arms to regimes like Saudi Arabia. We'll do exactly the same as there, and we'll maximise the pressure that we can. We've got to ensure. I'll give you the example of the United Nations Human Rights Commission, the investigation. Now another 2 years it's been given to investigate these war crimes. We will be putting pressure on to ensure there's a proper international commission, which is time limited, so we know exactly what went on. So in Jeremy Corbyn, the difference is this. Is that you have someone who's devoted his life to human rights, someone who's devoted his life to ensuring that we have foreign policies that actually abide by human rights but promote them as well.
I mean, the foreign policy, and normally we see a disconnect between the politics and the foreign policy here.
Yeah.
So what kind of concrete steps can we actually expect? Because obviously we know that Jeremy and you have been supporters and went on campaigns and so on, but then what kind of real kind of laws or kind of tangible effects that will translate?
Let's go through it. We've made it clear consistently now where there's regimes that abuse human rights, we should not be trading with them, we should not be selling them arms or giving them military support, we should be isolating them, we should be maximising the pressure upon them internationally, particularly through the United Nations. Now that's been our campaigning policy when we were members of Parliament and campaigning MPs. We've translated that into Labour Party policy now. So human rights is at our core. Jeremy Corbyn will be the first Prime Minister with that sort of human rights record going back, a generation now. And remember, when it came down to it, when the Tamils were suffering most, there weren't many politicians who stood up for them in this country. And Jeremy Corbyn was at the front of that in terms of the campaigning, but also the development of Labour Party policy on that basis.
Thank you very much for that. We'll move on to another topic, which is about economy. Because especially the Tamil community, or the Tamils in the UK, they have actually over the last 20 years or 30 years, they have actually contributed a lot to the economy here, and thriving small businesses and investors as well. Because one of the concerns is especially your policies that you're bringing in as Shadow Chancellor will affect them, because they see that the tax, high level of tax, or any business. So in terms of kind of to relate to them, like small business owners, people who have actually invested on a second house, because the pensions are not great at the moment, so have invested in a second house because they fear that your policies might actually affect them. So what is your answer?
Okay, look, let's be clear, they've got nothing to fear. We've got to ensure in this country that we grow the economy as well. Who are the engine drivers of that growth? Industrious people, that's what the Tamil people have always been. They've always been workers, always been industrious, always contributed, but also small and medium enterprises. That's the engine of our economy. If we're to have a successful economy. Look what happened in Germany. They have what they call the Mittelstand, which is small and medium enterprises that drive the engine of the economy, that get the growth in, and that create the high-skilled, high-paid jobs that we need in this country. But we want a fair taxation system. We can't have a situation where big corporations and the very rich, we're talking about the top 1 or 2%, we can't have a situation where, one, they're evading and avoiding their taxes, and we've now had exposure over the last few years about the industrial scale tax evasion and tax avoidance that's gone on in this country. And we can't have a situation where the corporations, the rich themselves, are not contributing effectively to the economy. So what we'll do is introduce a fair taxation system, tackle tax evasion and tax avoidance, and at the same time support small-scale businesses, small and medium enterprises, entrepreneurs themselves, and of course workers themselves, because we want to ensure we have a prosperous economy, but where that prosperity is shared by everybody. If we do that, if we support small and medium enterprises, if we support entrepreneurs and we support the people who create the wealth, the workers as well, we can grow the economy, but it does mean investment. Our problem at the moment is that we've had a long period of time under this Conservative government where they've borrowed lots of money. They've 700 billion they've borrowed in the last 7 years they've been in power. They haven't invested in our infrastructure. That hasn't created the sort of upgrade of our economy that we need, and we've fallen behind our competitors. So we're in a situation now where our economy is growing, but wages are stagnating or falling back. Wages haven't grown since 2007, 2008. So we need a fair economy, supporting workers themselves, supporting small businesses, investing in the long-term economy, sharing the prosperity.
Because this is another fear that they also have about the minimum wages. Because I mean, it's great that the minimum wages, if it's been raised, because in Britain we have one of the lowest in the developed nations. But on the other hand, businesses are already struggling. I mean, the way they look at it is that how they're going to actually fund that. I mean, small businesses.
So I understand that, completely understand that. That's why we've said we need a real living wage, and we're talking about £10 now by 2020, but for small businesses we'll use the employment support allowance so we support those small businesses to enable them to pay that living wage. We don't want a situation where you introduce a real living wage and it puts people out of business. We want to be able to support the small enterprises. But it is about fairness, you know. Some of the big companies at the moment, their chief executives or their directors are being paid something like 180 times the average worker's wage. You know, that can't be right. Can't be right in the situation we live in a country where, well, there's 4 million children living in poverty, and even 2/3 of them are in families where people are at work. So what we want to do, have a real living wage, support small businesses to pay that living wage so they're not affected, but make sure actually that we have a fair system where people can have a decent standard of living. I haven't met a Tamil yet who doesn't want to work. I haven't met one who hasn't wanted to contribute in some way, but I haven't met one either that believes in unfair wages either.
So we're moving on to Europe, because a sizable population of European citizens, Tamil European citizens, have actually moved into UK for education. Their colonial ties, where the English language is better for them, for their kids, and so on. And they're worried about what kind of Brexit that we are going to head towards, and do they have to return, and so on. I have heard like the Labour Party leader has actually said very clearly about the policies, but can you actually assure what kind of Brexit it would be, especially for the European citizens working here?
I'm worried myself. I'm worried as well that if the Conservatives get back into power, we're in a situation where European citizens who live here won't be secure, because they won't give any assurances about their future.
Because whereas she's saying, I mean, the Prime Minister is saying that she will actually look at that in a perspective with the British nationals living outside. So what that means?
Well, what's happening at the moment is the Prime Minister is trying to negotiate, but using European citizens as a negotiating tool, negotiating weapon. And what I've had in my area where people have come to see me, they're worried about their futures. They can't plan their futures because they haven't got the security of their European citizens here. And remember, our economy would not be effective, our economy would take a real hit if the European citizens here went back to Europe, the EU countries. We need to give EU citizens complete assurance. Now, what Jeremy Corbyn has said to Theresa May is that what we need to do, give them immediate assurances, and in that way, I think it would completely change the tone of our relationship in these negotiations. And we've met with socialist and social democratic leaders of parties across Europe. They're willing, I think, to give the UK citizens living in Europe the security that they need in return for what we will do with EU citizens here. You shouldn't be using people, individuals, people, EU citizens or others as bargaining chips in some negotiations. You're using them in a way which I think is fairly brutal. So we're saying when Labour comes to power, we will give European Union citizens here assurances on their rights that they can plan their futures, and we'd expect that in return for UK citizens in Europe.
So we can expect that as something kind of first year of immediate.
It would be immediate in the negotiations because we think it would completely change the tone of those negotiations. Because remember, our big desire is to ensure that we have access to the single market, tariff-free access. That's the only way we'll be able to protect jobs in this country, protect our economy. But we know our European partners want access to our market as well. So that will be a trade deal in terms of mutual interest.
So moving on, education, because the Tamil community are very much concerned about education, especially their kids' education, because that's some of the primary kind of factor they consider in their life, investment in education, and especially their kids. Now, the way the whole structure is going, because myself have experience as a governor in a primary school, like the cuts and the formula of like how it's been funded. Now, I heard Labour has promised and Jeremy has promised that there's going to be a new funding and so on. But the question is how and what, because it's not clear yet, like what kind of, is it, because it's difficult as well, because how are we going to support classroom size less than 30 and so on. So what tangible measures as a Chancellor in waiting or prospective Chancellor you will do when you get to power?
Look, the Tamil community has the same perspective as myself, where Tamil believe that education is a gift from one generation to another. It isn't a commodity to be bought and sold, but it's most probably one of the most important things that you need to build upon in society. So what does that mean? It means properly investing in education. We can't have a situation as it is at the moment where we're having the worst financial settlement for schools since the 1970s. So we're going back a generation. Schools right the way across the country are laying off teachers, laying off support staff, closing children's centres, Sure Start centres. It's a huge range of cuts. Governors are resigning because they can't cope anymore on managing their schools. Some schools are sending out letters to parents asking them to help contribute towards some of the costs of the school itself. That can't be right. When we come into power, and we'll be launching these policies over the next few weeks, when we come into power, we'll end the cuts in the school budgets. End the cuts in the school budgets. How can we do that? We believe that actually the bigger corporations should be making a better contribution towards society overall. What the Conservatives have done is that they've given tax giveaways to huge tax giveaways to corporations. We're talking about up to £70 billion and to the rich themselves, both inheritance tax, capital gains tax. And again, what we're trying to say is, who caused the crisis in 2007, 2008? Actually, the banking system and the bankers themselves. They've even cut the levies on the banks. So we feel that's unfair. If we ended those tax giveaways, we could put that money into education, end the school budget cuts. We want to go further though as well. We want to make sure skills training becomes free again, because they've introduced now a loan system for that. And we want to ensure that students go to university and don't get burdened by debt. So we want tuition fees abolished. Now we think we can afford it as we grow the economy. So the idea will be we'll establish a national education service so that literally from childhood right the way through to lifelong learning, as you get older, education will be free and it'll be good quality. The cuts at the moment in our schools means class sizes are increasing again. We've now got something like 500,000 children being taught in class sizes above 30. Now, if you remember, under a Labour government, we reduced class sizes below 30, and we did that by investing in education. We'll go back to investing in education again.
So I'll stay on the same topic. There is a concern about different kinds of schools, like the grammar schools and faith schools or different kinds of schools. So what is the policy on it? Are you going to scrap that all around?
We're in favour of comprehensive education. We believe all children should be taught together and treated equally and fairly. We're not in favour of grammar schools. The government is trying to promote grammar schools. They've put another £300 million worth into promoting of grammar schools. We don't think that's necessary. We're not closing down grammar schools, but we're not extending them either. In terms of faith schools, well, individuals may wish to have their children taught within their particular religion, their particular faith. That's been the tradition in this country. So we're not opposed to faith schools, but what we'd like to see is investment in comprehensive schools so that we can see all children taught together, treated equally, but also mixing with one another so you learn from each other's cultures. That in that way, I think you get a much richer society.
Finally, about NHS and larger proportion of young doctors, especially union doctors, are concerned about what's happening now, because especially the conditions and so on. But on the other hand, generally NHS is in crisis. Now, one of the things what will be your clear policies when you come in? I mean, obviously I heard about investments and so on, but what would be clear-cut policies? Will you be renationalize the whole thing, or are you going to actually still continue operating with some parts being private-public partnership? What would be kind of concrete steps you will take, especially in two directions, on the investment side of NHS as well as like the current junior doctor struggle? How you look at that?
Okay. So remember what the Conservatives did. They promised when they were elected in 2010 that there would be no reorganisation of the NHS. They then reorganised it, and that cost £3 billion. That reorganisation cost £3 billion. And it's resulted in, well, accident emergency units being closed, maternity units being closed, others now not able to cope. So on top of the reorganisation where they wasted £3 billion, in addition to that, they've now had a round of cuts as well. So what we're finding is waiting times for operations going up, sometimes really serious, which includes cancer, patients not getting the treatment they need on time. In addition to that, patients on trolleys, because there's no beds available. Cut back in social care so that elderly people who go into accident emergency can't then get a bed in hospital, then can't come out because the social care isn't within the community itself. We're in the worst crisis of the NHS since its foundation after the Second World War. So what will we do? We've just said we'll stop this reorganisation that's going on at the moment and start listening to the doctors and nurses again and the patients about what should be available within their particular community. So the accident emergency units, for example, that are being closed all around the country, will halt that and have a proper discussion with what is really needed by the clinicians themselves. Secondly, we'll ensure that the NHS gets the money it needs. We've seen this week that a number of NHS providers have said the sum that they needed, they asked for the government, was £10 billion. All they got was, well, the government said they put 10 billion in, then we discovered actually it was only 4.5 billion, so nowhere near enough. We'll make sure they get the money itself. But then on top of that, we'll ensure that we invest in social care so that elderly people can remain within their homes and looked after, or if they do go into hospital, there's social care when they come out again. Now again, as the Shadow Chancellor, when I become the Chancellor, that money will be found from a fair taxation system, but in addition to that, it will be found by ending the privatisation of the NHS. We're paying too much out to private companies within the NHS, and they're making large amounts of profits as a result. So we want to end privatisation of the NHS, bring the services back in-house, and make sure it's properly invested in the long term.
I mean, all the policies you have laid down, it's very clear, concrete. But what concerns most of the people is how is it possible?
Yeah.
How is it possible? Because the numbers are like all over the place. Like, everyone's actually giving different numbers, like in terms not just Labour but Conservatives as well. Because I saw the recent interview about like the 45 billion. Yeah. Now, the question is like, we will be putting this question to if and when a Conservative senior member available at some point to ask these questions. But what would you like to tell the community, or in general, like how as kind of layman on the street to understand where this fund's going to be available and have a concrete kind of explanation to that.
I've got a reputation of being a very hard-nosed manager. My job is to ensure that every policy promise is properly costed and a funding source is identified. So as we produce our manifesto for the election in the next week or so, every policy we're saying this is what we'll do, There'll be a detailed costing beside it, and there'll be a funding source. And my job will make sure that one, that funding source adds up to what we need, but also will be delivered as well. And it's based upon having, well, a fair taxation system, but a process by which we invest in our economy as well, and we grow that economy, but the rewards of that growth go into, well, proper wages and conditions, obviously, but investment as well within our public services. This isn't rocket science. This is about having a longer term plan where you actually know what you need, how you can secure the growth in the economy itself, and then how you take that growth and you invest in the long term. And I'll just give you an example. I've been working with the Confederation of British Industry, with Federation of Small Businesses, with trade unions, all of those organisations that work within our economy itself. And what they're saying is we're falling behind because we haven't invested for the last 7 years under this government effectively in our infrastructure. And that's about road, rail, broadband, alternative energy sources. We're falling behind. And they're saying, well, over the next decade, we need to spend about £500 billion. And I'm saying, well, government can invest some of that, private sector can invest the other. The private sector, the big corporations in this country, are sitting on between 500 and 700 billion pounds worth of earned income they're not investing. Why aren't they investing? Because the government isn't investing. There's no match funding going in. They don't see the dynamism coming from a government that's interested in growing the economy. We want to put government together with the private sector, with big business and small and medium enterprises, and almost follow the example in Germany where you have a long-term investment strategy. It's called long-term patient investment. But the most important thing is when that investment comes to fruition and you grow the economy, the rewards are shared by all of us, not just a small, tiny percentage at the top.
Thank you very much, John.
Thanks,
John. That's John McDonnell. Thank you very much.